Section 23 of Soldier's Pay by William Faulkner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Sections 1 to 6. 1. Joe? What you say, Loot? I'm going to get married, Joe. Sure you are, Loot, some day, tapping himself on the chest. What's that, Joe? I say good luck. You got a fine girl. Cecily? Joe? Hello. She'll get used to my face. You're damn right. Your face is all right. But easy there, don't knock 'em off. Attaboy, as the other lowered his fumbling hand. What do I have to wear 'em for, Joe? Get married as well without 'em, can't I? I'll be damned if I know why they make you wear 'em. I'll ask Margaret. Here, let me have 'em, he said, suddenly removing the glasses. Damn shame making you keep 'em on. How's that, better? Carry on, Joe. 2. San Francisco, California, April 24th, 1919. Margaret, dearest, I miss you so much. If I could only see each other and talk to each other. I sit in my room and I think you are the only woman for me. Girls are not like you. They are so young and dumb you can't trust them. I hope you are lonely for me like I am, just to know you are, sweetheart. When I kissed you that day I know you are the only woman for me, Margaret. You cannot trust them. I told her he's just kidding her. He won't get her a job in the movies. So I sit in my room and outside life goes on just the same, though we are 1,000 miles apart, wanting to see you like hell. I think of how happy we will be. I haven't told my mother yet, because we have been waiting. We ought to tell her, I think, if you think so. And she will invite you out here, and we can be together all day, riding and swimming and dancing and talking to each other. If I can arrange business affairs, I will come for you as soon as I can. It is hell without you. I miss you, and I love you like hell. J. 3. It had rained the night before, but this morning was soft as a breeze. Birds across the lawn, parabolic from tree to tree, mocked him as he passed lounging and slovenly in his careless, unpressed tweeds, and a tree near the corner of the veranda, turning upward its ceaseless white-bellied leaves, was a swirling silver veil stood on end, a fountain arrested forever, carven water. He saw that black woman in the garden among roses, blowing smoke upon them from her pursed mouth, bending and sniffing above them, and he joined her, with slow anticipated malice, mentally stripping her straight, dark, unemphatic dress downward from her straight back over her firm, quiet thighs. Hearing his feet on the gravel, she looked over her shoulder without surprise. Her poised cigarette balanced on its tip a wavering plume of vapor, and Jones said, I have come to weep with you. She met his stare, saying nothing, her other hand blanched upon a solid mosaic of red and green. Her repose absorbed all motion from her immediate atmosphere, so that the plume of her cigarette became rigid as a pencil, flowering its tip into nothingness. I mean your hard luck, losing your intended, he explained. She raised her cigarette and expelled smoke. He lounged nearer, his expensive jacket, which had evidently had no attention since he bought it, sagging to the thrust of his heavy hands, shaping his fat thighs. His eyes were bold and lazy, clear as a goat's. She got of him an impression of aped intelligence, imposed on an innate viciousness, the cat that walks by himself. Who are your people, Mr. Jones? She asked after a while. I am the world's little brother. I probably have a bar sinister in my scutcheon. In spite of me, my libido seems to be a complex regarding decency. What does that mean, she wondered. What is your escutcheon, then? One newspaper-wrapped bundle, couchant and rampant, one doorstep stone, on a field noir and damned froid. Device, quand mangerai-je? Oh, a foundling, she smoked again. I believe that is the term. It is too bad we are contemporary. You might have found the thing yourself. I would not have thrown you down. Thrown me down? You can never tell just exactly how dead these soldiers are, can you? You think you have him, and then the devil reveals as much idiocy as a normal sane person, doesn't he?" She skillfully pinched the coal from her cigarette end and flipped the stub in a white twinkling arc, grinding the coal under her toe. If that was an implied compliment. Only fools imply compliments. The wise man comes right out with it point blank. Imply criticism, unless the criticized is not within earshot. It seems to me that this is a rather precarious doctrine for one who is, if you will pardon me, not exactly a combative sort. Combative? Well, a fighting man, then. I can't imagine you lasting very long in an encounter with, say, Mr. Gilligan. Does that imply that you have taken Mr. Gilligan as a protector? No more than it implies that I expect compliments from you. For all your intelligence, you seem to have acquired next to no skill with women. Jones, remote and yellowly unfathomable, stared at her mouth. "For instance?" "For instance, Miss Saunders," she said wickedly. "You seem to have let her get away from you, don't you?" "Miss Saunders," repeated Jones, counterfeiting surprise, admiring the way she had turned the tables on him without reverting to sex. "My dear lady, can you imagine anyone making love to her? Epicene. Of course it is different with a man practically dead," he added. "He probably doesn't care much whom he marries, nor whether or not he marries at all." "No? I understood from your conduct the day I arrived that you had your eye on her, but perhaps I was mistaken after all." "Granted I had. You and I seem to be in the same fix now, don't we?" She pinched through the stem of a rose, feeling him quite near her. Without looking at him, she said, "You've already forgotten what I told you, haven't you?" He did not reply. She released her rose and moved slightly away from him. "That you have no skill in seduction. Don't you know I can see what you're leading up to, that you and I should console one another? That's too childish, even for you. I have had to play at too many of these sexual acrostics with poor boys whom I respected even if I didn't like them." The rose splashed redly against the front of her dark dress. She secured it with a pin. "Let me give you some advice," she continued sharply. "The next time you try to seduce anyone, don't do it with talk, with words. Women know more about words than men ever will, and they know how little they can ever possibly mean." Jones removed his yellow stare. His next move was quite feminine. He turned and lounged away without a word. For he had seen Emmy, beyond the garden, hanging washed clothes upon a line. Mrs. Powers, looking after his slouching figure, said, "Oh." She had just remarked Emmy raising garments to a line with formal gestures like a Greek mask. She watched Jones approach Emmy, saw Emmy, when she heard his step, poise a half-raised cloth in a formal arrested gesture, turning her head across her reverted body. "Damn the beast," Mrs. Powers thought, wondering whether or not to follow and interfere. "But what good would it do? He'll only come back later and playing Cerberus to Emmy." She removed her gaze and saw Gilligan approaching. He blurted, "Damn that girl! Do you know what I think? I think she—" "What girl?" "What's her name? Saunders. I think she's scared of something. She acts like she might have got herself into a jam of some kind and is trying to get out of it by taking the loot right quick. Scared. Flopping around like a fish. Why don't you like her, Joe? You don't want her to marry him?" "No, it ain't that. Just frets me to see her change her mind every 20 minutes. He offered her a cigarette, which she refused, and lit one himself. "I'm jealous, I guess," he said after a time, "seeing the loot getting married when neither 'em want to specially, while I can't get my girl at all." "What, Joe? You married?" He looked at her steadily. "Don't talk like that. You know what I mean." "Oh, Lord! Twice in 1 hour?" His gaze was so steady, so serious, that she looked quickly away. "What's that?" he asked. She took the rose from her dress and slipped it into his lapel. "Joe, what is the beast hanging around here for?" "Who? What beast?" He followed her eyes. "Oh, that damn feller. I'm going to beat hell out of him on principle some day. I don't like 'em." "Neither do I. Hope I'm there to see you do it." Has he been bothering you?" he asked quickly. She gave him her steady gaze. "Do you think he could?" "That's right," he admitted. He looked at Jones and Emmy again. "That's another thing. That Saunders girl lets him fool around her. I don't like anybody that will stand for him." "Don't be silly, Joe. She's just young and more or less of a fool about men." "If that's your polite way of putting it, I agree with you." His eyes touched her smooth cheek, blackly winged by her hair. "If you had let a man think you was going to marry him, you wouldn't blow hot and cold like that." She stared away across the garden, and he repeated, "Would you, Margaret?" "You're a fool yourself, Joe, only you're a nice fool." She met his intent gaze, and he said, "Margaret?" She put her swift, strong hand on his arm. "Don't, Joe, please." He rammed his hands in his pockets, turning away. They walked on in silence. 4. Spring, like a soft breeze, was in the rector's fringe of hair as with upflung head he tramped the porch like an old war horse who hears again a trumpet after he had long thought all wars were done. Birds in a wind across the lawn, parabolic from tree to tree, and a tree at the corner of the house turning upward its white-bellied leaves in a passionate, arrested rush. It and the rector faced each other in ecstasy. A friend came morosely along the path from the kitchen door. "Good morning, Mr. Jones," the rector boomed, scattering sparrows from the screening vine. The tree to his voice took a more unbearable ecstasy. Its twinkling leaves swirled in a never-escaping silver skyward rush. Jones, nursing his hand, replied good morning in a slow, obese anger. He mounted the steps, and the rector bathed him in a hearty exuberance. "Come round to congratulate us on the good news, eh? Fine, my boy, fine, fine. Yes, everything is arranged at last. Come in, come in." Emmy flopped onto the veranda belligerently. "Uncle Joe," she said, shooting at Jones a hot, exulting glance. Jones, nursing his hand, glowered at her. "God damn you, you'll suffer for this." "Eh? What is it, Emmy?" "Mr. Saunders is on the phone. He wants to know if you'll see him this morning." "I showed you. Teach you to fool with me." "Ah, yes. Mr. Saunders coming to discuss plans for the marriage, Mr. Jones." "Yes, sir." "I'll fix you." "What'll I tell him?" "Do it if you think you can. You never have come off very well yet, you fat worm." "Tell him, by all means, that I had intended calling on him myself." "Yes, indeed. Ah, Mr. Jones, we are all to be congratulated this morning." "Yes, sir." "You little slut." "Tell him, by all means, Emmy." "All right. I told you I'd do it. I told you you can't fool with me, didn't I now? And, Emmy, Mr. Jones will be with us for lunch. A celebration is in order, eh, Mr. Jones?" "Without doubt. We all have something to celebrate. That's what makes me so damn mad. You said you would, and I let you do it. Slam a door on my hand. Damn you to hell." "All right. He can stay if he wants to." "Damn you to hell." Emmy arrowed him another hot, exulting glance and slammed the door as a parting shot. The rector tramped heavily, happily like a boy. "Ah, Mr. Jones, to be young as he is, to have your life circumscribed, moved hither and yonder at the vacillations of such delightful pests. Women, women! How charming never to know exactly what you want, while we men are always so sure we do. Dullness, dullness, Mr. Jones. Perhaps that's why we like them, yet cannot stand very much of them. What do you think?" Jones, glumly silent, nursing his hand, said after a while, "I don't know, but it seemed to me your son has had extraordinarily good luck with his women." "Yes?" the rector said with interest. "How so?" "Well, I think you told me he was once involved with Emmy. Well, he no longer remembers Emmy. Damn her soul! Slam a door on me. And now he's about to become involved with another whom he will not even have to look at. What more could one ask than that?" The rector looked at him keenly and kindly a moment. "You've retained several of your youthful characteristics, Mr. Jones." "What do you mean?" asked Jones with defensive belligerence. A car drew up to the gate, and after Mr. Saunders had descended, drove away. "One in particular, that of being unnecessarily and pettily brutal about rather insignificant things. Ah," he added, looking up, Here's Mr. Saunders. Excuse me, will you?" "You will probably find Mrs. Powers and Mr. Gilligan in the garden," he said over his shoulder, greeting his caller. Jones, in a vindictive rage, saw them shake hands. They ignored him, and he lounged viciously past them, seeking his pipe. It eluded him, and he cursed it slowly, beating at his various pockets. "I had intended calling upon you to-day." The rector took his caller affectionately by the elbow. "Come in, come in." Mr. Saunders allowed himself to be propelled across the veranda. Murmuring a conventional response, the rector herded him heartily beneath the fanlight, down the dark hall and into the study, without noticing the caller's air of uncomfortable reserve. He moved a chair for the guest and took his own seat at the desk. Through the window he could see a shallow section of the tree that, unseen but suggested, swirled upward in an ecstasy of never-escaping silver-bellied leaves. The rector's swivel chair protested, tilting. "Ah, yes, you smoke cigars, I recall. Matches at your elbow." Mr. Saunders rolled his cigar slowly in his fingers. At last he made up his mind and lit it. "Well, the young people have taken things out of our hands, eh?" The rector spoke round his pipe stem. "I will say now that I have long desired it, and, frankly, I have expected it, though I would not have insisted, knowing Donald's condition, but as Cecily herself desires it." "Yes, yes," agreed Mr. Saunders slowly. The rector did not notice. "You know, I have been a staunch advocate of it all along. Mrs. Powers repeated your conversation to me." "Yes, that's right." "And do you know, I look for this marriage to be better than a medicine for him. Not my own idea," he added, in swift explanation. "Frankly, I was sceptical, but Mrs. Powers and Mr. Gilligan, advanced it first, and the surgeon from Atlanta convinced us all. He assured us that Cecily could do as much, if not more, for him than anyone. Those were his very words, if I recall correctly. And now, since she desires it so much, since you and her mother support her, do you know," he slapped his collar upon the shoulder, "do you know, were I a betting man, I would wager that we will not know the boy in a year's time." Mr. Saunders had trouble getting his cigar to burn properly. He bit the end from it savagely, then, wreathing his head in smoke, he blurted, "Mrs. Saunders seems to have a few doubts yet." He fanned the smoke away and saw the rector's huge face gone grey and quiet. "Not objections exactly, you understand," he added, hurriedly, apologetically. "Damn the woman, why wouldn't she have come herself instead of sending him?" The divine made a clicking sound. "This is bad. I had not expected this. Oh, I am sure we can convince her, you and I, especially with Cis on our side." He had forgotten his own scruples, forgotten that he did not want his daughter to marry anyone. "This is bad," the rector repeated, hopelessly. "She will not refuse her consent." Mr. Saunders lied hastily. "It is only that she is not convinced as to its soundness, considering Cecily's youth, you see." He finished with inspiration. "On the contrary, in fact, I only brought it up so that we could have a clear understanding. Don't you think it's best to know all the facts?" "Yes, yes." The rector was having trouble with his own tobacco. He put his pipe aside, pushing it away. He rose and tramped heavily along the worn path in the rug. "I'm sorry," said Mr. Saunders. "This was Donald, my son. He's dead." "But come, we're making a mountain out of a molehill," the rector exclaimed at last without conviction. "As you say, if the girl wants to marry Donald, I'm sure her mother will not refuse her consent. What do you think? Shall we call on her? Perhaps she does not understand the situation, that they care for each other so much. She's not seen Donald since he returned, and you know how rumors get about. This was Donald, my son. He's dead." He paused, mountainous and shapeless in his casual black, yearning upon the other. Mr. Saunders rose from his chair, and the rector took his arm lest he escape. "Yes, that is best. We will see her together and talk it over thoroughly before we make a definite decision." "Yes, yes," the rector repeated, flogging his own failing conviction, spurring it. "This afternoon, then?" "This afternoon," Mr. Saunders agreed. "Yes, that is our proper course. I'm sure she does not understand. You don't think she fully understands? This was Donald, my son. He's dead." "Yes, yes," Mr. Saunders agreed in his turn. Jones found his pipe at last, and nursing his bruised hand, he filled and lit it. 5. She had just met Mrs. Worthington in a store, and they had discussed putting up plums. Then Mrs. Worthington, saying goodbye, waddled away slowly to her car. The negro driver helped her in with efficient detachment and shut the door. "I'm sprier than her," thought Mrs. Burney, exultantly watching the other's gouty, painful movement. "Spite of she's rich and got a car," she added, feeling better through malice, suppressing her own bone aches, walking sprier than the rich one. "Spite of she's got money." And here approaching was that strange woman staying at Parson Mahone's, the one that come here with him, and that other man, getting herself talked about and right. The one everybody expected to marry him, and that he had throwed down for that boy-chasing Saunders girl. "Well," she remarked with comfortable curiosity, peering up into the calm white face of the tall dark woman in her dark dress with its immaculate cuffs and collar, "I hear you're going to have a marriage up at your house. That's so nice for Donald. He's quite sweet on her, ain't he?" "Yes, they were engaged for a long time, you know." "Yes, they was. But folks never thought she'd wait for him, let alone take him, sick and scratched up like he is. She's had lots of chances since." "Folks think lots of things that aren't true," Mrs. Powers reminded her, but Mrs. Burney was intent on her own words. "Yes, she's had lots of chances, but then Donald has too, ain't he?" she asked cunningly. "I don't know, you see. I haven't known him very long." "Oh, you ain't? Folks all thought you and him was old friends, like." Mrs. Powers looked down at her neat, cramped figure in its airproof black without replying. Mrs. Burney sighed. "Well, marriages is nice. My boy never married. Like's not he would by now. Girls was all crazy about him, only he went to war so young." Her peering, salacious curiosity suddenly left her. "You heard about my boy?" she asked with yearning. "Yes, they told me. Dr. Mahone did. He was a good soldier, wasn't he?" "Yes, and them folks got him killed with just a lot of men around. Nobody to do nothing for him. Seems like they might have took him into a house where women folks could have eased him. Them others came back spry and bragging much as you please. Trust them officers and things not to get hurt." Her washed blue eyes brooded across the quiet square. After a time she said, "You never lost no one you loved in the war, did you?" "No," Mrs. Powers answered gently. "I never thought so," the other one stated, fretfully. "You don't look like it, so tall and pretty. But then most didn't. He was so young," she explained, "so brave." She fumbled with her umbrella. Then she added briskly, "Mahone's boy come back, anyway. That's something. Especially as he's taking a bride." She became curious again, obscene. "He's all right, ain't he?" "All right? I mean, for marriage. He ain't. It's just, I mean, a man ain't no right to palm himself off on a woman if he ain't—" "Good morning," said Mrs. Powers curtly, leaving her cramped and neat in her meticulous airproof black, holding her cotton umbrella like a flag, stubborn, refusing to surrender. 6. "You fool, you idiot, marrying a blind man? A man with nothing, practically dead?" "He is not. He is not." "What do you call him, then? Aunt Callie Nelson was here the other day saying that the white folks had killed him." "You know nigger talk doesn't mean anything. They probably wouldn't let her worry him, so she says he—" "Nonsense! Aunt Callie has raised more children than I can count. If she says he's sick, he is sick." "I don't care. I'm going to marry him." Mrs. Saunders sighed creakingly. Cecily stood before her, flushed and obstinate. "Listen, honey. If you marry him, you are throwing yourself away. All your chances, all your youth and prettiness, all the men that like you, men who are good matches." "I don't care," she repeated stubbornly. "Think! There are so many you can have for the taking, so much you can have. A big wedding in Atlanta, with all your friends for bridesmaids, clothes, a wedding trip, and then to throw yourself away after your father and I have done so much for you." "I don't care. I'm going to marry him." "But why? Do you love him?" "Yes, yes." "That scar, too?" Cecily's face blanched as she stared at her mother. Her eyes became dark, and she raised her hand delicately. Mrs. Saunders took her hand and drew her resisting onto her lap. Cecily protested tautly, but her mother held her, drawing her head down to her shoulder, smoothing her hair. "I'm sorry, baby. I didn't mean to say that, but tell me what it is." Her mother would not fight fair. She knew this with anger, but the older woman's tactics scattered her defenses of anger. She knew she was about to cry, then it would be all up. "Let me go," she said, struggling, hating her mother's unfairness. "Hush, hush. There now, lie here and tell me what it is. You must have some other reason." She ceased to struggle and became completely lax. "I haven't. I just want to marry him. Let me go, please, Mamma." "Cecily, did your father put this idea in your head?" She shook her head, and her mother turned her face up. "Look at me." They stared at each other, and Mrs. Saunders repeated, "Tell me what your reason is." "I can't." "You mean you won't?" "I can't tell you." She slipped suddenly from her mother's lap, but Mrs. Saunders held her kneeling against her knee. "I won't," she cried, struggling. The other held her tightly. "You're hurting me." "Tell me." Cecily wrenched herself free and stood. "I can't tell you. I have just got to marry him." "Got to marry him? What do you mean?" She stared at her daughter, gradually remembering old rumours about Mahone, gossip she had forgot. "Got to marry him? You mean that a daughter of mine with a blind man, a man who has nothing, a pauper?" Cecily stared at her mother and her face flamed. "You said that to— Oh, you're not my mother. You are somebody else." Suddenly she cried like a child, wide-mouthed, not even hiding her face. She whirled, running. "Don't ever speak to me again," she gasped, and fled wailing up the stairs, and a door slammed. Mrs. Saunders sat, thinking, tapping her teeth monotonously with a fingernail. After a while she rose, and going to the telephone, she called her husband downtown. End of section 23. Read by Sandra. Montreal, 2022. Section 24 of Soldier's Pay by William Faulkner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Continued. Section 7. Voices. The town. "I wonder what that woman that came home with him thinks about it, now he's taken another one. If I were that Saunders girl, I wouldn't take a man that brought another woman right up to my door, you might say. And that new one, what'll she do now? Go away and get another man, I guess. I hope she'll learn enough to get a well one this time. Funny goings-on in that house. And a preacher of the gospel, too. Even if he is Episcopal, if he wasn't such a nice man. George Farr. It isn't true, Cecily, darling, sweetheart. You can't, after your body prone and narrow as a pool dividing. The town. I hear that boy of Mahone's, that Hurt fellow, and that girl of Saunders are going to get married. My wife said they never would, but I said all the time. Mrs. Burney. Men don't know. They should have looked out for him better, saying he never wanted for nothing. George Farr. Cecily, is this death? The town. There's that soldier that came with Mahone. I guess that woman'll take him now. But maybe she don't have to. He might have been saving time himself. Well, wouldn't you if you was him? Sergeant Madden. Powers. A man's face spitted like a moth on a lance of flame. Powers. Rotten luck for her. Mrs. Burney. Dewey, my boy. Sergeant Madden. No, Mum, he was all right. We did all we could. Cecily Saunders. Yes, Donald. I will get used to your poor face, Donald. George, my dear love, take me away, George. Sergeant Madden. Oh, yes, he was all right. A man on a fire step, screaming with fear. George Farr. Cecily, how could you? The town. That girl, time she was took in hand by somebody, running round town nearly naked. Good thing he's blind, ain't it? I guess she hopes he'll stay blind, too. Margaret Powers. No. Goodbye, dear, dead Dick, ugly, dead Dick. Joe Gilligan. He's dying. He gets the woman he doesn't want even, while I am not dying. Margaret, what shall I do? What can I say? Emmy. Come here, Emmy? Ah, come to me, Donald. But he's dead. Cecily Saunders. George, my lover, my poor dear, what have we done? Mrs. Burney. Dewey, so brave, so young. This was Donald, my son. He is dead. 8. Mrs. Powers mounted the stairs under Mrs. Saunders' curious eyes. The older woman had been cold, almost rude, but Mrs. Powers had won her point, and choosing Cecily's door from her mother's directions, she knocked. After a while she knocked again and called, Miss Saunders? Silence was again a hushed, tense interval when Cecily's muffled voice came through the door. Go away. Please, she insisted, I want to see you a moment. No, go away. But I must see you. There was no reply, and she added, I have just talked to your mother and to Dr. Mahone. Let me come in, won't you? She heard movement, a bed, then another interval. Fool, taking time to powder her face. But you would too, she told herself. The door opened under her hand. Powder only made the traces of tears more visible, and Cecily turned her back as Mrs. Powers entered the room. She could see the indentation of a body on the bed and a crumpled pillow. Mrs. Powers, not being offered a chair, sat on the foot of the bed, and Cecily, across the room, leaning in a window and staring out, said ungraciously, What do you want? How like her this room is, thought the caller, observing pale maple and a triple mirrored dressing table bearing a collection of fragile crystal and delicate clothing carelessly about on chairs. On the floor, on a chest of drawers, was a small camera picture framed. May I look? She asked, knowing instinctively who it was. Cecily, stubbornly presenting her back in a thin, formless garment, through which light from the window passed, revealing her narrow torso, made no reply. Mrs. Powers approached and saw Donald Mahone, bareheaded in a shabby unbuttoned tunic, standing before a corrugated iron wall, carrying a small resigned dog casually by the scruff of the neck like a handbag. That's so typical of him, isn't it? She commented. Cecily said rudely, What do you want with me? That's exactly what your mother asked me, you know. She seemed to think I was interfering also. Well, aren't you? Nobody asked you to come here. Cecily turned, leaning her hip against the window ledge. I don't think it's interference when it's warranted, though, do you? Warranted? Who asked you to interfere? Did Donald do it, or are you trying to scare me off? You needn't tell me Donald asked you to get him out of it. It'll be a lie. But I'm not. I don't intend to. I'm trying to help you both. Oh, you are against me. Everybody's against me except Donald, and you keep him shut up like a prisoner. She turned quickly and leaned her head against the window. Mrs. Powers sat quietly examining her frail revealed body under the silly garment she wore, a webby, cloying thing worse than nothing, and a fit complement to the single belaced garment it revealed above the long hushed gleams of her stockings. If Cellini had been a hermit priest, he might have imagined her, Mrs. Powers thought, wishing mildly she could see the other naked. At last she rose from the bed and crossed to the window. Cecily kept her head stubbornly averted, and expecting tears, she touched the girl's shoulder. Cecily, she said quietly. Cecily's green eyes were dry, stony, and she moved swiftly across the room with her delicate, narrow stride. She stood holding the door open. Mrs. Powers at the window did not accept. Did she ever forget herself, she wondered, observing the studied grace of the girl's body turned on the laxed ball of a thigh. Cecily met her gaze with one of haughty, commanding scorn. Won't you even leave the room when you are asked? She said, making her swift, coarse voice sound measured and cold. Mrs. Powers, thinking, oh, hell, what's the use, moved so as to lean her thigh against the bed. Cecily, without changing her position, moved the door for emphasis. Standing quietly, watching her studied fragility. Her legs are rather sweet, she admitted, but why all this posing for me? I'm not a man. Mrs. Powers ran her palm slowly along the smooth wood of the bed. Suddenly the other slammed the door and returned to the window. Mrs. Powers followed. Cecily, why can't we talk about it sensibly?" The girl made no reply, ignoring her, crumpling the curtain in her fingers. "Miss Saunders?" "Why can't you let me alone?" Cecily flared suddenly, flaming out at her. "I don't want to talk to you about it. Why do you come to me?" Her eyes darkened. They were no longer hard. "If you want him, take him then. You have every chance you could want, keeping him shut up there so that even I can't see him." "But I don't want him. I'm trying to straighten things out for him. Don't you know that if I had wanted him I would have married him before I brought him home?" "You tried it and couldn't. That's why you didn't. Oh, don't say it wasn't," she rushed on as the other would have spoken. "I saw it that first day that you were after him. And if you weren't, why do you keep on staying here?" "You know that's a lie," Mrs. Powers replied calmly. "Then what makes you so interested in him if you aren't in love with him?" "This is hopeless." She put her hand on the other's arm. Cecily shrank away quickly, and she returned to lean again against the bed. She said, "Your mother's against this, and Donald's father expects it. And what chance will you have against your mother?" "Against yourself." "I certainly don't need any advice from you." Cecily turned her head. Her haughtiness, her anger were gone, and in their place was a thin, hopeless despair. Even her voice, her whole attitude had changed. "Don't you see how miserable I am?" she said pitifully. "I didn't mean to be rude to you, but I don't know what to do. I don't know. I am in such trouble. Something terrible has happened to me. Please." Mrs. Powers, seeing her face, went to her quickly, putting her arm about the girl's narrow shoulders. Cecily avoided her. "Please, please go." "Tell me what it is." "No, no, I can't. Please." They paused, listening. Footsteps approaching, stopped beyond the door. A knock, and her father's voice called her name. "Yes?" "Dr. Mahone is downstairs. Can you come down?" The two women stared at each other. "Come," Mrs. Powers said. Cecily's eyes went dark again, and she whispered, "No, no, no," trembling. "Sis," her father repeated. "Say yes," Mrs. Powers whispered. "Yes, Daddy, I'm coming." "All right." The footsteps retreated, and Mrs. Powers drew Cecily toward the door. The girl resisted. "I can't go like this," she said hysterically. "Yes, you can. It's all right. Come." Mrs. Saunders, sitting militant, formal, and erect upon her chair, was saying as they entered, "May I ask what this woman has to do with it?" Her husband chewed a cigar. Light falling upon the rector's face held it like a grey, bitten mask. Cecily ran to him. "Uncle Joe!" she cried. "Cecily," her mother said sharply, "what do you mean, coming down like that?" The rector rose, huge and black, embracing her. "Uncle Joe," she repeated, clinging to him. "Now, Robert," Mrs. Saunders began, but the rector interrupted her. "Cecily," he said, raising her face. She twisted her chin and hid her face against his coat. "Robert," said Mrs. Saunders. The rector spoke greyly. "Cecily, we have talked it over together, and we think your mother and father—" She moved in her silly, revealing garment. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, staring at her father. He would not meet her gaze, but sat, slowly twisting his cigar. The rector continued, "We think that you will They say that Donald is going to die, Cecily," he finished. Lithe as a sapling, she thrust herself backward against his arm, bending to see his face, staring at him. "Oh, Uncle Joe, have you gone back on me too?" she cried, passionately. 9. George Farr had been quite drunk for a week. His friend, the drug clerk, thought he was going crazy. He had become a local landmark, a tradition. Even the town soaks began to look upon him with respect, calling him by his given name, swearing undying devotion to him. In the intervals of belligerent or rollicking or maudlin inebriation, he knew periods of devastating despair like a monstrous bliss, like that of a caged animal, of a man being slowly tortured to death, a minor monotony of pain. As a rule, though, he managed to stay fairly drunk, her narrow body sweetly dividing, naked. "Have another drink. I'll kill you if you keep on fooling around her. My girl, her narrow. Another drink. Oh, God! Oh, God! Sweetly dividing for another. Have drink, what hell I care. Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God, oh, God! Though nice people no longer spoke to him on the streets, he was, after a fashion, cared for and protected by casual acquaintances, and friends, both black and white, as in the way of small towns particularly, and of the inferior classes anywhere. He sat glassy-eyed among fried smells, among noises, at an oilcloth-covered table. Clover blossoms, clover blossoms, sang a nasal voice terribly. The melody ticked off at spaced intervals by a small monotonous sound like a clock bomb going off like this. Clock tick ver tick ver tick tick ble ticker ticks tick ticks. Beside him sat two of his new companions, quarrelling, spitting, holding hands, and weeping over the cracked interminability of the phonograph record. Clover blossoms, it repeated with saccharine passion. When it ran down, they repaired to a filthy alley behind the filthier kitchen to drink of George Farr's whiskey. Then they returned and played the record through again, clutching hands while frank tears slid down their otherwise unwashed cheeks. Clover blossoms. Truly, vice is a dull and decorous thing. No life in the world is as hard, requiring so much sheer physical and moral strength as the so-called primrose path. Being good is much less trouble. Clover blossoms. After a while his attention was called to the fact that someone had been annoying him for some time. Focusing his eyes, he at last recognized the proprietor in an apron on which he must have dried his dishes for weeks. "What in hell you want?" he asked with feeble, liquid belligerence, and the man finally explained to him that he was wanted on the telephone in a neighboring drug-store. He rose, pulling himself together. Clover blossoms. After a few years, he languished from a telephone mouthpiece, holding himself erect, watching without interest a light globe over the prescription desk describing slow, concentric circles. "George?" There was something in the unknown voice speaking his name with such anguish as to almost shock him sober. "George. This George. Hello. George, it's Cecily. Cecily." Drunkenness left him like a retreating wave. He could feel his heart stop, then surge, deafening him, blinding him with his own blood. "George, do you hear me? Ah, George, to have been drunk now! Cecily, oh, Cecily! Yes, yes," gripping the instrument as though this would keep her against escape. "Yes, Cecily, Cecily, it's George. Come to me now, at once. Yes, yes, now. Come, George, darling, hurry, hurry." "Yes," he cried again. "Hello, hello?" The line made no response. He waited, but it was dead. His heart pounded and pounded, hotly. He could taste his own hot, bitter blood in his throat. "Cecily! Oh, Cecily!" He plunged down the length of the store, and while a middle-aged clerk filling a prescription poised his bottle to watch in dull amazement, George Farr tore his shirt open at the throat and thrust his whole head beneath a gushing water tap in a frenzy of activity. "Cecily! Oh, Cecily!" 10. He seemed so old, so tired as he sat at the head of the table toying with his food, as if the very fibre of him had lost all resilience. Gilligan ate with his usual informal appetite, and Donald and Emmy sat side by side so that Emmy could help him. Emmy enjoyed mothering him, now that she could never have him again for a lover. She objected with passionate ardour when Mrs. Powers offered to relieve her. The Donald she had known was dead. This one was but a sorry substitute, but Emmy was going to make the best of it, as women will. She had even got accustomed to taking her food after it had cooled. Mrs. Powers sat watching them. Emmy's shock of no particular colour hair was near his worn head in intent devotion. Her labour-worried hand seemed to have an eye of its own, so quick, so tender it was to anticipate him and guide his hand with the food she had prepared for him. Mrs. Powers wondered which Donald Emmy loved the more, wondering if she had not perhaps forgotten the former one completely, save as a symbol of sorrow. Then the amazing logical thought occurred to her that here was the woman for Donald to marry. Of course it was. Why had no one thought of that before? Then she told herself that no one had done very much thinking during the whole affair, that it had got on without any particular drain on any intelligence. Why did we take it for granted that he must marry Cecily and no other? Yet we all accepted it as an arbitrary fact, and off we went with our eyes closed and our mouths open like hounds in full cry. But would Emmy take him? Wouldn't she be so frightened at the prospect that she'd be too self-conscious with him afterward to care for him as skillfully as she does now? Wouldn't it cause her to confuse in her mind, to his detriment, two separate Donalds, a lover and an invalid? I wonder what Joe will think about it. She looked at Emmy, impersonal as omnipotence, helping Donald with effacing skill, seeming to envelop him, yet never touching him. Anyway, I'll ask her, she thought, sipping her tea. Night was come. Tree frogs, remembering last night's rain, resumed their monotonous moulding of liquid beads of sound. Grass blades and leaves, losing shapes of solidity, gained shapes of sound. The still suspire of earth, of the ground preparing for slumber, flowers by day, spikes of bloom, became with nights spikes of scent. The silver tree at the corner of the house hushed its never still, never escaping ecstasy. Already toads hopped along concrete pavements, drinking poisoned heat through their dragging bellies. Suddenly the rector started from his dream. We are making mountains from molehills as usual. If she wants to marry Donald, I'm sure her people will not withhold their consent always. Why should they object to their daughter marrying him? Do you know— Hush, she said. He looked up at her, startled. Then, seeing her warning glance touch Mahone's oblivious head, he understood. She saw Emmy's wide, shocked eyes on her, and she rose at her place. You're through, aren't you? She said to the rector. Suppose we go to the study. Mahone sat quiet, chewing. She could not tell whether or not he'd heard. She passed behind Emmy and, leaning to her, whispered, I want to speak to you. Don't say anything to Donald. The rector, preceding her, fumbled the light on in the study. You must be careful, she told him, how you talk before him, how you tell him. Yes, he agreed apologetically. I was so deep in thought. I know you were. I don't think it's necessary to tell him at all until he asks. And that will never be. She loves Donald. She will not let her people prevent her marrying him. I'm not customarily in favor of such a procedure as instigating a young woman to marry against her parents' wishes, but in this case— Do you not think that I am inconsistent? That I am partial because my son is involved? No, no, of course not. Don't you agree with me that Cecily will insist on the wedding? Yes, indeed. What else could she say? Gilligan and Mahone had gone, and Emmy was clearing the table when she returned. Emmy whirled upon her. She ain't going to take him? What was Uncle Joe saying? Her people don't like the idea, that's all. She hasn't refused, but I think we'd better stop it now, Emmy. She's changed her mind so often nobody can tell what she'll do. Emmy turned back to the table, lowering her head, scraping a plate. Mrs. Powers watched her busy elbow, hearing the little clashing noises of china and silver. A bowl of white roses shattered slowly upon the center of the table. What do you think, Emmy? I don't know, Emmy replied sullenly. She ain't my kind. I don't know nothing about it. Mrs. Powers approached the table. Emmy, she said. The other did not raise her head, made no reply. She turned the girl gently by the shoulder. Would you marry him, Emmy? Emmy straightened hotly, clutching a plate and a fork. Me? Me marry him? Me take another's leavings? Donald, Donald. And her leavings at that. Her that's run after every boy in town, dressed up in her silk clothes. Mrs. Powers moved back to the door, and Emmy scraped dishes fiercely. This plate became blurred. She blinked and saw something splash on it. She shan't see me cry, she whispered passionately, bending her head lower, waiting for Mrs. Powers to ask her again. Donald, Donald. When she was young, going to school in the spring, having to wear coarse dresses and shoes while other girls wore silk and thin leather, being not pretty at all while other girls were pretty, walking home to where work waited her, while other girls were riding in cars or having ice cream or talking to boys and dancing with them, with boys that had no use for her. Sometimes he would step out beside her, so still, so quick, all of a sudden, and she didn't mind not having silk. And when they swam and fished and roamed the woods together, she forgot she wasn't pretty even, because he was beautiful, with his body all brown and quick, so still, making her feel beautiful too. And when he said, "Come here, Emmy," she went to him, and wet grass and dew under her and over her his head, with the whole sky for a crown and the moon running on them like water that wasn't wet and that you couldn't feel. Marry him? Yes. Yes. Let him be sick. She would cure him. Let him be a Donald that had forgotten her. She'd not forgotten. She could remember enough for both of them. Yes, yes, she cried, soundlessly stacking dishes, waiting for Mrs. Powers to ask her again. Her red hands were blind. Tears splashed fatly on her wrists. Yes, yes, trying to think it so loudly that the other must hear. She shan't see me cry, she whispered again, but the other woman only stood in the door watching her busy back. So she gathered up the dishes slowly, there being no reason to linger any longer. Keeping her head averted, she carried the dishes to the pantry door, slowly, waiting for the other to speak again. But the other woman said nothing, and Emmy left the room, her pride forbidding her to let the other see her tears. 11. The study was dark when she passed, but she could see the rector's head in dim silhouette against the more spacious darkness outside the window. She passed slowly on to the veranda, leaning her quiet, tall body against a column in the darkness beyond the fan of light from the door. She listened to the hushed myriad life of night things, to the slow voices of people passing unseen along an unseen street, watching the hurried staring twin eyes of motor cars like restless insects. A car, slowing, drew up to the corner, and after a while a dark figure came along the pale gravel of the path, hurried yet diffident. It paused and screamed delicately in mid-path. Then it sped on toward the steps, where it stopped again, and Mrs. Powers stepped forward from beside her post. "Oh," gasped Miss Cecily Saunders, starting, lifting her hand slimly against her dark dress. "Mrs. Powers?" "Yes. Come in, won't you?" Cecily ran with nervous grace up the steps. "It was a frog," she explained between her quick respirations. "I nearly stepped. She shuddered. A slim, muted flame hushed darkly in dark clothing. "Is Uncle Joe here? May I—" Her voice died away diffidently. "He's in the study," Mrs. Powers answered. What has happened to her? She thought. Cecily stood so that the light from the hall fell full on her. There was in her face a thin, nervous despair, a hopeless recklessness, and she stared at the other woman's shadowed face for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, thank you," suddenly, hysterically, and ran quickly into the house. Mrs. Powers looked after her, then following, saw her dark dress. "She's going away," Mrs. Powers thought, with conviction. Cecily flew on ahead like a slim dark bird into the unlighted study. "Uncle Joe," she said, poised, touching either side of the door frame. The rector's chair creaked suddenly. "Eh?" he said, and the girl sailed across the room like a bat, dark in the darkness, sinking at his feet, clutching his knees. He tried to raise her, but she clung to his legs the tighter, burrowing her head into his lap. "Uncle Joe, forgive me. Forgive me. Yes, yes, I knew you would come to us. I told them. No, no, you've always been so good, so sweet to me that I couldn't—" She clutched him again fiercely. "Cecily, what is it? Now, you mustn't cry about it. Come now, what is it?" Knowing a sharp premonition, he raised her face, trying to see it, but it was only a formless, soft blur warmly in his hands. "Say you forgive me first, dear Uncle Joe, won't you? Say it, say it. If you won't forgive me, I don't know what'll become of me." His hands, slipping downward, felt her delicate, tense shoulders, and he said, "Of course I forgive you." "Thank you. Oh, thank you. You are so kind." She caught his hand, holding it against her mouth. "What is it, Cecily?" he asked, quietly, trying to soothe her. She raised her head. "I'm going away." "And you aren't going to marry Donald?" She lowered her head to his knees again, clutching his hand in her long, nervous fingers, holding it against her face. "I cannot. I cannot. I am not a good woman any more, dear Uncle Joe. Forgive me. Forgive me." He withdrew his hand, and she let herself be raised to her feet, feeling his arms, his huge, kind body. "There, there," patting her back with his gentle, heavy hand. "Don't cry." "I must go," she said at last, moving slimly and darkly against his bulk. He released her. She clutched his hand again, sharply, letting it go. "Good-bye," she whispered, and fled, swift and dark as a bird, gracefully to a delicate tapping of heels as she had come. She passed Mrs. Powers on the porch without seeing her, and sped down the steps. The other woman watched her slim, dark figure until it disappeared. After an interval, the car that had stopped at the corner of the garden flashed on its lights and drove away. Mrs. Powers, pressing the light switch, entered the study. The rector stared at her as she approached the desk, quiet and hopeless. "Cecily has broken the engagement, Margaret, so the wedding is off." "Nonsense," she told him sharply, touching him with her firm hand. "I'm going to marry him myself. I intended to all the time. Didn't you suspect?" 12. San Francisco, California, April 25th, 1919. Darling Margaret, I told Mother last night, and of course she thinks we are too young, but I explained to her how times have changed since the war, how the war makes you older than they used to. I see fellows my age that did not serve specially flying, which is an education in itself, and they seem like kids to me, because at last I have found the woman I want, and my kid days are over. After knowing so many women, to found you so far away when I did not expect it. Mother says for me to go in business and make money if I expect a woman to marry me, so I'm going to start in tomorrow. I've got the place all ready. So it will not be long till I see you, and take you in my arms at last and always. How can I tell you how much I love you? You are so different from them. Loving you has already made me a serious man, realizing responsibilities. They are all so silly compared with you, talking of jazz and going someplace where all the time I've been invited on parties, but I refuse, because I rather sit in my room thinking of you, putting my thoughts down on paper. Let them have their silly fun. I think of you always, and if it did not make you so unhappy, I want you to think of me always. But don't. I would not make you unhappy at all, my own dearest. So think of me, and remember I love you only, and will love you only, will love you always. Forever yours, Julian. 13. The Baptist minister, a young dervish in a white lawn tie, being most available, came and did his duty and went away. He was young and fearfully conscientious and kind-hearted, upright and passionately desirous of doing good, so much so that he was a bore. But he had soldiered after a fashion, and he liked and respected Dr. Mahone, refusing to believe that simply because Dr. Mahone was Episcopal he was going to hell as soon as he died. He wished them luck, and fled busily away, answering his own obscure compulsions. They watched his busy, energetic backside until he was out of sight. Then Gilligan silently helped Mahone down the steps and across the lawn to his favourite seat beneath the tree. The new Mrs. Mahone walked silently beside them. Silence was her wont, but not Gilligan's. Yet he had spoken no word to her. Walking near him, she put out her hand and touched his arm. He turned to her, a face so bleak, so reft, that she knew a sharp revulsion, a sickness with everything. "Dick, Dick, how well you got out of this mess!" She looked quickly away across the garden beyond the spire where pigeons crooned the afternoon away, unemphatic as sleep, biting her lips. Married, she had never felt so alone. Gilligan settled Mahone in his chair with his impersonal, half-reckless care. Mahone said, "Well, Joe, I'm married at last." "Yes," answered Gilligan. His careless spontaneity was gone. Even Mahone noticed it in his dim, oblivious way. "I say, Joe." "What is it, Lute?" Mahone was silent, and his wife took her customary chair, leaning back and staring up into the tree. He said at last, "Carry on, Joe." "Not now, Lute. I don't feel so many. Think I'll take a walk," he answered, feeling Mrs. Mahone's eyes on him. He met her gaze harshly, combatively. "Joe," she said, quietly, bitterly. Gilligan saw her pallid face, her dark, unhappy eyes, her mouth like a tired scar, and he knew shame. His own bleak face softened. "All right, Lute," he said, quietly matching her tone with a trace of his old ambiguous unseriousness. "What'll it be? Bust up a few more minor empires, eh?" Just a trace, but it was there. Mrs. Mahone looked at him again with gratitude and that old grave happiness which he knew so well, unsmiling but content, which had been missing for so long, so long. And it was as though she had laid her firm, strong hand on him. He looked quickly away from her face, sad and happy, not bitter any more. "Carry on, Joe." End of section 24. Read by Czandra, Montreal, 2022. Section 25 of A Soldier's Pay by William Faulkner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. San Francisco, California, April 27th, 1919. My dearest sweetheart, just a line to let you know that I've gone into business, into the banking business, making money for you, to give ourselves the position in the world you deserve and a home of our own. The work is congenial, talking to other people in the business that don't know anything about aviation. All they think about is going out to dance with men. Every day means one day less for us to be with you forever. All my love. Yours forever, Julian. 2. 9-day or 90-day or 900-day sensations have a happy faculty for passing away into the oblivion whence pass sooner or later all of men's inventions. Keeps from getting the world all cluttered up. You say right off that this is God's work, but it must be a woman. No man could be so utilitarian. But then women preserve only those things which can or might be used again, so this theory is also exploded. After a while there were no more of the local curious to call. After a while those who had said, "I told you so," when Miss Cecily Saunders let it be known that she would marry the parson's son, and who said, "I told you so," when she did not marry the parson's son, forgot about it. There were other things to think and talk of. This was the lying in period of the KKK, and the lying out period of Mr. Wilson, a democratish gentleman living in Washington, D.C. Besides, it was all legal now. Miss Cecily Saunders was safely married, though nobody knows where they was from the time they drove out of town in George Farr's car until they was properly married by a priest in Atlanta the next day. But then I always told you about that girl. They all hoped for the worst, and that Mrs. What's-her-name, that tall black-headed woman at Mahone's, had at last married someone, putting an end to that equivocal situation, and so April became May. There were fair days when the sun, becoming warmer and warmer, rising, drank off the dew, and flowers bloomed like girls ready for a ball, then drooped in the languorous fulsome heat like girls after the ball, when earth, like a fat woman, recklessly trying giddy hat after hat, trying a trimming of apple and pear and peach, threw it away, tried narcissi and jonquil and flag, threw it away. So early flowers bloomed and passed, and later flowers bloomed to fade and fall, giving place to yet later ones. Fruit blossoms were gone, pear was forgotten. What were once tall candlesticks, silvery with white bloom, were now tall jade candlesticks of leaves beneath the blue cathedral of sky, across which in hushed processional went clouds like choir boys, slow and surpliced. Leaves grew larger and greener until all rumour of azure and silver and pink had gone from them. Birds sang and made love and married and built houses in them, and in the tree at the corner of the house that yet swirled its white-bellied leaves in never-escaping skyward ecstasies, bees broke clover upon the lawn, interrupted at intervals by the lawn-mower and its informal, languid conductor. Their mode of life had not changed. The rector was neither happy nor unhappy, neither resigned nor protesting. Occasionally he entered some dream within himself. He conducted services in the dim oaken tunnel of the church, while his flock hissed softly among themselves or slept between the responses, while pigeons held their own crooning rituals, of audible slumber in the spire that, arcing across motionless young clouds, seemed slow and imminent with ruin. He married 2 people and buried 1. Gilligan found this ominous and said so aloud. Mrs. Mahone found this silly and said so aloud. Mrs. Worthington sent her car for them at times, and they drove into the country, regretting the dogwood. The 3 of them, 2 of them did, that is, Mahone had forgotten what dogwood was. The 3 of them sat beneath the tree, while one of them wallowed manfully among polysyllabics, and another of them sat motionless, neither asleep nor awake. They could never tell whether or not he heard, nor could they ever tell whether or not he knew whom he had married. Perhaps he didn't care. Emmy, efficient and gentle, mothering him, was a trifle subdued. Gilligan still slept on his cot at the foot of Mahone's bed lest he be needed. "You 2 are the ones who should have married him," his wife remarked with quiet wit. 3. Mrs. Mahone and Gilligan had resumed their old status of companionship and quiet pleasure in each other's company. Now that he no longer hoped to marry her, she could be freer with him. "Perhaps this is what we needed, Joe. Anyway, I never knew anyone I liked half this much." They walked slowly in the garden along the avenue of roses, which passed beneath the 2 oaks, beyond which, against a wall, poplars in a restless formal row were like columns of a temple. "You're easy pleased, then," Gilligan answered with sour assumed moroseness. He didn't have to tell her how much he liked her. "Poor Joe," she said. "Cigarette, please." "Poor you," he retorted, giving her one. "I'm all right. I ain't married." "You can't escape forever, though. You're too nice. Safe for the family. We'll stand hitched." "Is that a bargain?" he asked. "Sufficient unto the day, Joe." After a while he stayed her with his hand. "Listen." They halted, and she stared at him intently. "What?" "There's that damn mockingbird again. Hear him? What's he got to sing about, you reckon?" "He's got plenty to sing about. April's got to be May, and still spring isn't half over. Listen." 4. Emmy had become an obsession with Janarius Jones. Such an obsession that it had got completely out of the realm of sex into that of mathematics, like a paranoia. He manufactured chances to see her, only to be repulsed. He lay in wait for her like a highwayman. He begged, he threatened, he tried physical strength, and he was repulsed. It had got to where, had she acceded suddenly, he would have been completely reft of one of his motivating impulses, of his elemental impulse to live. He might have died. Yet he knew that if he didn't get her soon, he would become crazy, an imbecile. After a time it assumed the magic of numbers. He had failed twice. This time success must be his, or the whole cosmic scheme would crumble, hurling him screaming into blackness where no blackness was, death where death was not. Janarius Jones, by nature and inclination a Turk, was also becoming an Oriental. He felt that his number must come. The fact that it would not was making an idiot of him. He dreamed of her at night. He mistook other women for her, other voices for hers. He hung skulking about the rectory at all hours, too wrought up to come in where he might have to converse sanely with sane people. Sometimes the rector, tramping huge and oblivious in his dream, flushed him in out-of-the-way corners of concealment, flushed him without surprise. "Ah, Mr. Jones," he would say, starting like a goaded elephant. "Good morning." "Good morning, sir," Jones would reply, his eyes glued on the house. "You're out for a walk?" "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." And Jones would walk hurriedly away in an opposite direction as the rector, entering his dream again, resumed his own. Emmy told Mrs. Mahone of this with scornful contempt. "Why don't you tell Joe, or let me tell him?" Mrs. Mahone asked. Emmy sniffed with capable independence. "About that worm? I can take care of him all right. I do my own fighting." "And I bet you're good at it, too." And Emmy said, "I guess I am." 5. April had become May. fair days and wet days in which rain ran with silver lances over the lawn, in which rain dripped leaf to leaf while birds still sang in the hushed damp greenness under the trees, and made love and married and built houses and still sang, in which rain grew soft as the grief of a young girl grieving for the sake of grief. Mahone hardly ever rose now. They had got him a movable bed, and upon this he lay, sometimes in the house, sometimes on the veranda, where the wistaria inverted its cool lilac flame while Gilligan read to him. They had done with Rome, and they now swam through the tedious charm of Rousseau's Confessions to Gilligan's hushed, childish delight. Kind neighbours came to inquire. The specialist from Atlanta came once by request, and once on his own initiative, making a friendly call, and addressing Gilligan meticulously as doctor, spent the afternoon chatting with them and went away. Mrs. Mahone and he liked each other immensely. Dr. Gary called once or twice and insulted them all, and went away nattily smoking his slender rolled cigarettes. Mrs. Mahone and he did not like each other at all. The rector grew greyer and quieter, neither happy nor unhappy, neither protesting nor resigned. Wait until next month. He will be stronger then. This is a trying month for invalids, don't you think so? He asked his daughter-in-law. Yes, she would tell him, looking out at the green world, the sweet, sweet spring. Yes, yes. 6. It was a postcard. You buy them for a penny, stamp and all. The post office furnishes writing material free. Got your letter. Will write later. Remember me to Gilligan and Lute Mahone. Julian L. 7. Mahone was asleep on the veranda, and the other three sat beneath the tree on the lawn watching the sun go down. At last the reddened edge of the disk was sliced like a cheese by the wistaria-covered lattice wall, and the neutral buds were a pale agitation against the dead afternoon. Soon the evening star would be there above the poplar tip, perplexing it, immaculate and ineffable, and the poplar was vain as a girl darkly in an arrested passionate ecstasy. Half of the moon was a coin, broken palely near the zenith, and at the end of the lawn the first fireflies were like lazily blown sparks from cool fires. A Negro woman passing crooned a religious song, mellow and passionless and sad. They sat talking quietly. The grass was becoming grey with dew, and she felt dew on her thin shoes. Suddenly Emmy came round the corner of the house running, and darted up the steps and through the entrance, swift in the dusk. "What in the world—" began Mrs. Mahone. Then they saw Jones, like a fat satyr, leaping after her, hopelessly distanced. When he saw them he slowed immediately and lounged up to them, slovenly as ever. His yellow eyes were calmly opaque, but she could see the heave of his breathing. Convulsed with laughter, she at last found her voice. "Good evening, Mr. Jones." "Say," said Gilligan with interest, "what was you—" "Hush, Joe," Mrs. Mahone told him. Jones's eyes, clear and yellow, obscene and old in sin as a goat's, roved between them. "Good evening, Mr. Jones." The rector became abruptly aware of his presence. "Walking again, eh?" "Running," Gilligan corrected, and the rector repeated, "Eh?" looking from Jones to Gilligan. Mrs. Mahone indicated a chair. "Sit down, Mr. Jones. You must be rather fatigued, I imagine." Jones stared toward the house, tore his eyes away, and sat down. The canvas sagged under him, and he rose and spun his chair so as to face the dreaming facade of the rectory. He sat again. "Say," Gilligan asked him, "what was you doing, anyway?" Jones eyed him briefly, heavily. "Running," he snapped, turning his eyes again to the dark house. "Running?" the divine repeated. "I know. I seen that much from here. What was you running for, I asked?" "Reducing, perhaps," Mrs. Mahone remarked with quiet malice. Jones turned his yellow stare upon her. Twilight was gathering swiftly. He was a fat and shapeless mass, palely tweeded. "Reducing, yes, but not to marriage." "I wouldn't be so sure of that if I were you," she told him. A courtship like that will soon reduce you to anything almost." "Yeah," Gilligan amended, "if that's the only way you got to get a wife, you better pick out another one besides Emmy. You be a shadow, time you catch her. That is," he added, "if you aim to do your courting on foot." "What's this?" the rector asked. Perhaps Mr. Jones was merely preparing to write a poem. "Living it first, you know," Mrs. Mahone offered. Jones looked at her sharply. "Atalanta," she suggested in the dusk. "Atlanta?" repeated Gilligan. "What?" "Try an apple next time, Mr. Jones," she advised. "Or a handful of salt, Mr. Jones," added Gilligan in a thin falsetto. Then in his natural voice, "But what's Atlanta got?" "Or a cherry, Mr. Gilligan," said Jones viciously. "But then I am not God, you know." "Shut your mouth, fellow," Gilligan told him roughly. "What's this?" the rector repeated. Jones turned to him heavily explanatory. "It means, sir, that Mr. Gilligan is under the impression that his wit is of as much importance to me as my actions are to him." "Not me," denied Gilligan with warmth. "You and me don't have the same thoughts about anything, fellow." "Why shouldn't they be?" the rector asked. "It is but natural to believe that one's actions and thoughts are as important to others as they are to one's self, is it not?" Gilligan gave this his entire attention. It was getting above his head, beyond his depth. But Jones was something tangible, and he had already chosen Jones for his own. "Naturally," agreed Jones with patronage. "There is a kinship between the human instruments of all action and thought and emotion. Napoleon thought that his actions were important. Swift thought his emotions were important. Savonarola thought his beliefs were important, and they were. But we're discussing Mr. Gilligan." "Say," began Gilligan. "Very apt, Mr. Jones," murmured Mrs. Mahone above the suggested triangle of her cuffs and collar. "A soldier, a priest, and a dyspeptic." "Say," Gilligan repeated, "who's Swift, anyway? I kind of got bogged up back there." "Mr. Jones is, according to his own statement. You are Napoleon, Joe." "Him? Not quite swift enough to get himself a girl, though, way he was gaining on Emmy. You ought to have a bicycle," he suggested. "There's your answer, Mr. Jones," the rector told him. Jones looked toward Gilligan's fading figure in disgust, like that of a swordsman who's been disarmed by a peasant with a pitchfork. "That's what association with the clergy does for you," he said crassly. "What is it?" Gilligan asked. "What did I say wrong?" Mrs. Mahone leaned over and squeezed his arm. "You didn't say anything wrong, Joe. You were grand." Jones glowered sullenly in the dusk. "By the way," he said suddenly, "how is your husband today?" "Just the same, thank you." "Stands wedded life as well as can be expected, does he?" She ignored this. Gilligan watched him in leashed anticipation. He continued, "That's too bad. You had expected great things from marriage, hadn't you? Sort of a miraculous rejuvenation." "Shut up, fellow," Gilligan told him. "What you mean, anyway?" "Nothing, Mr. Galahad. Nothing at all. I merely made a civil inquiry. Shows that when a man marries, his troubles continue, doesn't it?" "Then you oughtn't to have no worries about your troubles," Gilligan told him savagely. "What?" "I mean, if you don't have no better luck than you have twice that I know of." "He has a good excuse for one failure, Joe," Mrs. Mahone said. They both looked toward her voice. The sky was bold with still disseminated light that cast no shadow, and branches of trees were rigid as coral in a mellow, tideless sea. "Mr. Jones says that to make love to Miss Saunders would be epicene." "Epicene? What's that?" "Shall I tell him, Mr. Jones, or will you?" "Certainly. You intend to anyway, don't you?" "Epicene is something you want and can't get, Joe." Jones rose viciously. "If you will allow me, I'll retire, I think," he said savagely. "Good evening." "Sure," agreed Gilligan with alacrity, rising also. "I'll see Mr. Jones to the gate. He might get mixed up and head for the kitchen by mistake. Emmy might be one of them epicines, too." Without seeming to hurry, Jones faded briskly away. Gilligan sprang after him. Jones, sensing him, whirled in the dusk, and Gilligan leaped upon him. "For the good of your soul," Gilligan told him joyously, "you might say that's what running with preachers does for you, mightn't you?" he panted as they went down. They rolled in dew, and an elbow struck him smartly under the chin. Jones was up immediately, and Gilligan, tasting his bitten tongue, sprang in pursuit. But Jones retained his lead. "He has sure learned to run from somebody," Gilligan grunted. "Practising on Emmy so much, I guess. Wisht I was Emmy now, till I catch him." Jones doubled the house and plunged into the dreaming garden. Gilligan, turning the corner of the house, saw the hushed expanse where his enemy was, but his enemy himself was out of sight. Roses bloomed quietly under the imminence of night. Hyacinths swung pale bells, waiting for another day. Dusk was a dream of arrested time. The mockingbird rippled it tentatively, and everywhere blooms slept passionately, waiting for tomorrow. But Jones was gone. He stopped to listen upon the paling gravel between the slow, unpickable passion of roses, seeing the pale broken coin of the moon attain a richer lustre against the unemphatic sky. Gilligan stilled his heaving lungs to listen, but he heard nothing. Then he began systematically to beat the firefly-starred scented dusk of the garden, beating all available cover, leaving not a blade of grass unturned. But Jones had got clean away. The slow hands of dusk had removed him as cleanly as the prestidigitator reaves a rabbit from an immaculate hat. He stood in the centre of the garden and cursed Jones thoroughly on the off chance that he might be within hearing. Then Gilligan slowly retraced his steps, retracing the course of the race through the palpable violet dusk. He passed the unlighted house where Emmy went somewhere about her duties, where at the corner of the veranda near the silver trees twilight musicked ecstasy. Mahone slept on his movable bed and on across the lawn, while evening, like a ship with twilight-coloured sails, dreamed on down the world. The chairs were formless blurs beneath the tree, and Mrs. Mahone's presence was indicated principally by her white collar and cuffs. As he approached, he could see dimly the rector reclined in slumber, and the woman's dark dress shaped her against the dull white of her canvas chair. Her face was pallid, winged either side by her hair. She raised her hand as he drew near. "He's asleep," she whispered as he sat beside her. "He got away, damn him," he told her in exasperation. "Too bad. Better luck next time." "You bet. And there'll be a next time soon as I see him again." Night was almost come. Light, all light, passed from the world, from the earth, and leaves were still. Night was almost come, but not quite. Day was almost gone, but not quite. Her shoes were quite soaked in dew. "How long he has slept!" She broke the silence diffidently. "We'll have to wake him soon for supper." Gilligan stirred in his chair, and almost as she spoke the rector sat, hugely and suddenly up. "Wait, Donald," he said, lumbering to his feet. With elephantine swiftness he hurried across the lawn toward the darkly dreaming house. Did he call? They spoke together in a dark foreboding. They half rose and stared toward the house, then at each other's indistinct white face. "Did you?" The question hung poised in the dusk between them, and here was the evening star, bloomed miraculously at the poplar's tip, and the slender tree was a leafed and passionate Atalanta, poisoning her golden apple. "No, did you?" he replied, but they heard nothing. "He dreamed," she said. "Yes," Gilligan agreed, "he dreamed." 8. Donald Mahone lay quietly conscious of unseen, forgotten spring, of greenness neither recalled nor forgot. After a time, the nothingness in which he lived took him wholly again, but restlessly. It was like a sea into which he could neither completely pass nor completely go away from. Day became afternoon, became dusk and imminent evening. Evening, like a ship with twilight-coloured sails, dreamed down the world darkly toward darkness. And suddenly he found that he was passing from the dark world in which he'd lived for a time he could not remember, again into a day that had long passed, that had already been spent by those who lived and wept and died, and so, remembering it, this day was his alone, the one trophy he had reft from time and space, per ardua ad astra. I never knew I could carry this much petrol, he thought in unsurprised ubiquity, leaving a darkness he did not remember for a day he had long forgot, finding that the day, his own familiar day, was approaching noon. It must be about 10 o'clock, for the sun was getting overhead and a few degrees behind him, because he could see the shadow of his head bisecting in an old familiarity the hand which held the control column and the shadow of the cockpit rim across his flanks, filling his lap, while the sun fell almost directly downward upon his other hand, lying idly on the edge of the fuselage. Even the staggered lower wing was partly shadowed by the upper one. Yes, it is about 10, he thought, with a sense of familiarity. Soon he would look at the time and make sure, but now, with the quick skill of practice and habit, he swept the horizon with a brief observing glance, casting a look above, banking slightly to see behind, all clear. The only craft in sight were far away to the left, a cumbersome observation plane doing artillery work. A brief glance divulged a pair of scouts high above it, and above these he knew were probably 2 more. I'd have a look, he thought, knowing instinctively that they were Huns, calculating whether or not he could reach the spotter before the protecting scouts saw him. No, I guess not, he decided. Better get on home. Fuel's low. He settled his swinging compass needle. Ahead of him and to the right, far away, what was once Ypres was like the cracked scab on an ancient festering sore. Beneath him were other shining sores lividly on a corpse that would not be let to die. He passed on lonely and remote as a gull. Then suddenly it was as if a cold wind had blown upon him. What is it, he thought? It was that the sun had been suddenly blotted from him. The empty world, the sky, were yet filled with lazy spring sunlight, but the sun that had been full upon him had been brushed away as by a hand. In the moment of realizing this, cursing his stupidity, he dived steeply, slipping to the left. 5 threads of vapor passed between the upper and lower planes, each one nearer his body. Then he felt 2 distinct shocks at the base of his skull, and vision was reft from him as if a button somewhere had been pressed. His trained hand nosed the machine up smartly, and finding the Vickers release in the darkness, he fired into the bland morning, marbled and imminent with March. Sight flickered on again like a poorly made electrical contact. He watched holes pitting into the fabric near him like a miraculous smallpox, and as he hung poised firing into the sky, a dial on his instrument board exploded with a small sound. Then he felt his hand, saw his glove burst, saw his bared bones. Then sight flashed off again, and he felt himself lurch, falling until his belt caught him sharply across the abdomen, and he heard something gnawing through his frontal bone like mice. "You'll break your damn teeth there," he told them, opening his eyes. His father's heavy face hung over him in the dusk like a murdered Caesar's. He knew sight again, and an imminent nothingness more profound than any yet, while evening, like a ship with twilight-coloured sails, drew down the world, putting calmly out to an immeasurable sea. "That's how it happened," he said, staring at him. End of section 25, read by Czandra, Montreal, 2022. Section 26 of Soldier's Pay by William Faulkner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 1. Sex and Death. The front door and the back door of the world. How indissolubly are they associated in us. In youth they lift us out of the flesh. In old age they reduce us again to the flesh, one to fatten us, the other to flay us for the worm. When are sexual compulsions more readily answered than in war, or famine, or flood, or fire? Jones, lurking across the street, saw the coast clear at last. First marched a uniformed, self-constituted guard, led by a subaltern with 3 silver V's on his sleeve, and a Boy Scout bugler furnished by the young Baptist minister, a fiery-eyed dervish who had served in the YMCA. And then, fatly arrogant as a cat, Jones let himself through the iron gate. The last motor car trailed slowly up the street, and the casuals gathered through curiosity. The town should raise a monument to Donald Mahone, with effigies of Margaret Mahone Powers and Joe Gilligan for caryatids, and the little blackguard boys, both black and white, and including young Robert Saunders, come to envy the boy bugler, drifted away. And still cat-like, Jones mounted the steps and entered the deserted house. His yellow goat's eyes became empty as he paused, listening. Then he moved quietly toward the kitchen. The procession moved slowly across the square. Country people in town to trade turned to stare vacuously. Merchant and doctor and lawyer came to door and window to look. The city fathers, drowsing in the courthouse yard, having successfully circumvented sex, having reached the point where death would look after them instead of they after death, waked and looked and slept again. Into a street among and between horses and mules tethered to wagons, it passed into a street bordered by shabby negro stores and shops, and here was Louche, standing stiffly at salute as it passed. "Who dat, Louche?" "Mr. Donald Mahone." "Well, Jesus, we all gwine dat way some day. All roads lead to de graveyard." Emmy sat at the kitchen table, her head between her hard elbows, her hands clasping behind her in her hair. How long she had sat there she did not know, but she had heard them clumsily carrying him from the house, and she put her hands over her ears, not to hear. But it seemed as if she could hear, in spite of her closed ears, those horrible, blundering, utterly unnecessary sounds, the hushed scraping of timid footsteps, the muted thumping of wood against wood, that passing left behind an unbearable unchastity of stale flowers, as though flowers themselves, getting a rumour of death, became corrupt, all the excruciating ceremony for disposing of human carrion. So she had not heard Mrs. Mahone until the other touched her shoulder. "I would have cured him, if they had just let me marry him instead of her." At the touch, Emmy raised her swollen, blurred face, swollen because she couldn't seem to cry. "If I could just cry! You are prettier than me, with your black hair and your painted mouth. That's the reason." "Come, Emmy," Mrs. Mahone said. "Let me alone. Go away," she said fiercely. "You got him killed. Now bury him yourself." "He would have wanted you to come, Emmy," the other woman said gently. "Go away. Let me alone, I tell you." She dropped her head to the table again, bumping her forehead. There was no sound in the kitchen save a clock. Life, death, life, death, life, death, forever and ever. If I could only cry. She could hear the dusty sound of sparrows, and she imagined she could see the shadows growing longer across the grass. Soon it will be night, she thought, remembering that night long, long ago, the last time she had seen Donald, her Donald, not that one, and he had said, "Come here, Emmy," and she had gone to him. Her Donald was dead long, long ago. The clock went life, death, life, death. There was something frozen in her chest, like a dishcloth in winter. The procession moved beneath arching iron letters. "Rest in peace in cast repetition. Our motto is one for every cemetery, a cemetery for everyone throughout the land." Away, following where fingers of sunlight pointed among cedars, doves were cool, throatily unemphatic among the dead. "Go away," Emmy repeated to another touch on her shoulder, thinking she had dreamed. It was a dream, she thought, and the frozen dish-rag in her chest melted with unbearable relief, becoming tears. It was Jones who had touched her, but anyone would have been the same, and she turned in a passion of weeping, clinging to him. "I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord." Jones's yellow stare enveloped her like amber, remarking her sunburned hair and her foreshortened thigh, wrung by her turning body into high relief. Whosoever believeth in me, though he were dead. My God, when will she get done weeping? First she wets my pants and my coat, but this time she'll dry it for me, or I'll know the reason why. Yet shall he live, and whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Emmy's sobbing died away. She knew no sensation save that of warmth and languorous contentment, emptiness, even when Jones raised her face and kissed her. "Come, Emmy," he said, raising her by the armpits. She rose obediently, leaning against him warm and empty, and he led her through the house and up the stairs to her room. Outside the window, afternoon became abruptly rain, without warning, with no flapping of pennons nor sound of trumpet to herald it. The sun had gone, had been recalled as quickly as a usurer's note, and the doves fell silent or went away. The Baptist dervish's Boy Scout lipped his bugle, sounding taps. 2. "Hi, Bob," called a familiar voice, that of a compatriot. "Let's go up to Miller's. They're all playing ball up there." He looked at his friend, making no reply to the greeting, and his expression was so strange that the other said, "What you looking so funny about? You ain't sick, are you?" "I don't have to play ball if I don't want to, do I?" he replied with sudden heat. He walked on while the other boys stood watching him with open mouth. After a while he too turned and went on, stopping once or twice to look again at his friend, become suddenly strange and queer. Then he passed, whooping from sight, forgetting him. How strange everything looked. This street, these familiar trees. Was this his home, here, where his mother and father were, where Sis lived, where he ate and slept, lapped closely round with safety and solidity, where darkness was kind and sweet for sleeping? He mounted the steps and entered, wanting his mother, but of course she hadn't got back from... He found himself running suddenly through the hall toward a voice raised in comforting, crooning song. Here was a friend, mountainous in blue calico, her elephantine thighs undulating, gracious as the wake of a ferry boat as she moved between table and stove. She broke off her mellow, passionless song, exclaiming, "Bless your heart, honey, what is it?" But he did not know. He only clung to her comforting, voluminous skirt in a gust of uncontrollable sorrow, while she wiped biscuit dough from her hands on a towel. Then she picked him up and sat upon a stiff-backed chair, rocking back and forth and holding him against her balloon-like breast until his fit of weeping shuddered away. Outside the window the afternoon became abruptly rain, without warning, with no flapping of pennons nor sound of trumpet to herald it. 3. There was nothing harsh about this rain. It was grey and quiet as a benediction. The birds did not even cease to sing, and the west was already thinning to a moist and imminent gold. The rector, bareheaded, walked slowly, unconscious of the rain and the dripping trees, beside his daughter-in-law across the lawn houseward, and they mounted the steps together, passing beneath the dim and unwashed fanlight. Within the hall he stood, while water ran down his face and dripped from his clothing in a series of small sounds. She took his arm and led him into the study and to his chair. He sat obediently, and she took his handkerchief from the breast of his coat and wiped the rain from his temples and face. He submitted, fumbling for his pipe. She watched him as he sprinkled tobacco liberally over the desk top, trying to fill the bowl. Then she quietly took it from his hand. "Try this. It is much simpler," she told him, taking a cigarette from her jacket pocket and putting it in his mouth. "You've never smoked one, have you?" "Eh? Oh, thank you. Never too old to learn, eh?" She lit it for him, and then she quickly fetched a glass from the pantry. Kneeling beside the desk, she drew out drawer after drawer until she found the bottle of whiskey. He seemed to have forgotten her until she put the glass in his hand. Then he looked up at her from a bottomless, grateful anguish, and she sat suddenly on the arm of his chair, drawing his head against her breast. His untasted drink in one hand, and his slowly burning cigarette lifting an unshaken plume of vapour from the other, and after a while the rain passed away and the dripping eaves but added to the freshened silence, measuring it, spacing it off, and the sun, breaking through the west, took a last look at the earth before going down. "So you will not stay," he said at last, repeating her unspoken decision. "No," she said, holding him. For, before her descending, the hill crossed with fireflies. At its foot among dark trees was unseen water, and Emmy walked slowly on, feeling the tall wet grass sopping her to the knees, draggling her skirt. She walked on, and soon was among trees that, as she moved overhead like dark ships parting the star-filled river of the sky, letting the parted waters join again behind them with never a ripple. The pool lay darkly in the dark, sky and trees above it, trees and sky beneath it. She sat down on the wet earth, seeing through the trees the moon, becoming steadily brighter in the darkening sky. A dog saw it also, and bayed, a mellow, long sound that slid immaculately down a hill of silence, yet at the same time seemed to linger about her like a rumour of a far despair. Tree trunks taking light from the moon, streaks of moonlight in the water. She could almost imagine she saw him standing there across the pool with her beside him. Leaning above the water, she could almost see them, darting keen and swift and naked, flashing in the moon. She could feel earth strike through her clothes against legs and belly and elbows. The dog bayed again, hopeless and sorrowful, dying away. After a while she rose slowly, feeling her damp clothes, thinking of the long walk home. Tomorrow was wash day. 5. "Damn," said Mrs. Mahone, staring at the bulletin board. Gilligan, setting down her smart leather bags against the station wall, remarked briefly, "Late?" 30 minutes. What beastly luck. Well, can't be helped. Want to go back to the house and wait? No, I don't. I don't like these abortive departures. Get my ticket, please. She gave him her purse, and standing on tiptoe to see her reflection in a raised window, she did a few deft things to her hat. Then she sauntered along the platform to the admiration of those casuals always to be found around small railway stations anywhere in these United States. And yet continentals labour under the delusion that we spend all of our time working. Freedom comes with the decision. It does not wait for the act. She felt freer, more at peace with herself than she had felt for months. But I won't think about that, she decided deliberately. It is best just to be free, not to let it into the conscious mind. To be consciously anything argues a comparison, a bond with antithesis. Live in your dream, do not attain it, else comes satiety, or sorrow. Which is worse, I wonder? Dr. Mahone in his dream, reft, restored, reft again. Funny for someone, I guess. And Donald with his scar and his stiffened hand, quiet in the warm earth, in the warmth and the dark, where the one cannot hurt him and the other he will not need. No dream for him. The ones with whom he now sleeps don't care what his face looks like. Per ardua ad astra. And Jones, what dream is his? Nightmare, I hope, she said aloud, viciously, and one collarless and spitting tobacco said, "Mum?" with interest. Gilligan reappeared with her ticket. "You're a nice boy, Joe," she told him, receiving her purse. He ignored her thanks. "Come on, let's walk a ways." "Will my bags be all right there, do you think?" "Sure." He looked about, then beckoned to a Negro youth reclining miraculously on a steel cable that angled up to a telephone pole. "Here, son." The Negro said, "Sir," without moving. "Get up, dar boy. Dat white man talking to you," said a companion, squatting on his heels against the wall. The lad rose, and a coin spun arcing from Gilligan's hand. "Keep your eye on them bags till I come back, will you?" "All right, Cap'n." The boy slouched over to the bags and became restfully and easily static beside them, going to sleep immediately like a horse. "Damn 'em, they do what you say, but they make you feel so immature, don't they?" she suggested. "That's it. Like you was a kid or something, and that they'd look after you even if you don't know exactly what you want. You are a funny sort, Joe, and nice. Too nice to waste." Her profile was sharp, pallid against a doorway darkly opened. "I'm giving you a chance not to waste me. Come on, let's walk a bit." She took his arm and moved slowly along the track, conscious that her ankles were being examined. The two threads of steel ran narrowing and curving away beyond trees. If you could see them as far as you can see, further than you can see. Huh? Asked Gilligan, walking moodily beside her. Look at the spring, Joe. See? In the trees. Summer's almost here, Joe. Yes, summer is almost here. Funny, ain't it? I'm always kind of surprised to find that things get on about the same, spite of us. I guess old nature does too much of a wholesale business to ever be surprised at us, let alone worrying if we ain't quite the fellows we think we ought to have been. Holding his arm, walking a rail. What kind of fellows do you think we ought to have been, Joe? I don't know what kind of a girl, you think you are, and I don't know what kind of a fellow I think I am. But I know you, and I tried to help nature make a good job out of a poor one without having no luck at it. Flat leaves cupped each a drop of sunlight, and the trees seemed coolly on fire with evening. Here was a wooden footbridge crossing a stream and a footpath mounting a hill. Let's sit on the rail of the bridge, she suggested, guiding him toward it. Before he could help her, she had turned her back to the rail, and her straightening arms raised her easily. She hooked her heels over a lower rail, and he mounted beside her. Let's have a cigarette. She produced a pack from her handbag, and he accepted one, scraping a match. Who has had any luck in this business? She asked. The loot has. No, he hasn't. When you're married, you're either lucky or unlucky, and when you're dead, you aren't either. You aren't anything. That's right. He don't have to bother about his luck any more. The padre's lucky, though. How? Well, if you have hard luck and your hard luck passes away, ain't you lucky? I don't know. You're too much for me now, Joe. And how about that girl? Fellow's got money, I hear, and no particular brains. She's lucky. Do you think she's satisfied? Gilligan gazed at her attentively, not replying. Think how much fun she could have got out of being so romantically widowed and so young. I'll bet she's cursing her luck this minute. He regarded her with admiration. I always thought I'd like to be a buzzard, he remarked, but now I think I'd like to be a woman. Good gracious, Joe, why in the world? Now, long as you're being one of them Sibyls, tell me about this bird Jones. He's lucky. How lucky? Well, he gets what he wants, don't he? Not the woman he wants. Not exactly. Certainly he don't get all the women he wants. He has failed twice, to my knowledge, but failure don't seem to worry him. That's what I mean by lucky. Their cigarettes arced together into the stream, hissing. I guess brass gets along about as well as anything else with women. You mean stupidity. No, I don't. Stupidity, that's the reason I can't get the one I want. She put her hand on his arm. You aren't stupid, Joe, and you aren't bold either. Yes, I am. Can you imagine me considering anybody else's feelings when there's something I want? I can't imagine you doing anything without considering someone else's feelings. Offended, he became impersonal. Of course, you are entitled to your own opinion. I know I ain't bold like the man in that story, you remember? Accosted a woman on the street and her husband was with her and knocked him down. When he got up, brushing himself off, a man says, For heaven's sake, friend, do you do that often? And the bird says, Sure, of course I get knocked down occasionally, but you'd be surprised. I guess he just charged the beating to overhead. He finished with his old sardonic humor. She laughed out, and she said, Why don't you try that, Joe? He looked at her quietly for a time. She met his gaze unwavering, and he slipped to his feet facing her, putting his arm around her. What does that mean, Margaret? She made no reply, and he lifted her down. She put her arms over his shoulders. You don't mean anything by it, he told her quietly, touching her mouth with his. His clasp became lax. Not like that, Joe. Not like what? He asked stupidly. For answer, she drew his face down to hers and kissed him with slow fire. Then they knew that after all they were strangers to each other. He hastened to fill an uncomfortable interval. Does that mean you will? I can't, Joe, she answered, standing easily in his arms. But why not, Margaret? You never give me any reason. She was silent in profile against sunshot green. "If I didn't like you so much I wouldn't tell you. But it's your name, Joe. Gilligan. I couldn't marry a man named Gilligan." He was really hurt. "I'm sorry," he said dully. She laid her cheek against his. On the crest of the hill tree trunks were a barred grate beyond which the fires of evening were dying away. "I could change it," he suggested. Across the evening came a long sound. "There's your train," he said. She thrust herself slightly from him to see his face. "Joe, forgive me, I didn't mean that." "That's all right," he interrupted, patting her back with awkward gentleness. "Come on, let's get back." The locomotive appeared blackly at the curve, plumed with steam like a sinister squat night, and grew larger without seeming to progress. But it was moving, and it roared past the station in its own good time, bearing the puny controller of its destiny like a goggled, greasy excrescence in its cab. The train jarred to a stop and an eruption of white-jacketed porters. She put her arms about him again, to the edification of the bystanders. "Joe, I didn't mean that. But don't you see I've been married twice already, with damn little luck either time, and I just haven't the courage to risk it again. But if I could marry anyone, don't you know it would be you? Kiss me, Joe." He complied. "Bless your heart, darling. If I married you, you'd be dead in a year, Joe. All the men that marry me die, you know." "I'll take the risk," he told her. "But I won't. I'm too young to bury 3 husbands." People got off, past them, other people got on, and above all, like an obligato, the vocal competition of cabmen. "Joe, does it really hurt you for me to go?" He looked at her dumbly. "Joe!" she exclaimed, and a party passed them. It was Mr. and Mrs. George Farr. They saw Cecily's stricken face as she melted, graceful and fragile and weeping, into her father's arms. And here was Mr. George Farr, morose and thunderous, behind her, ignored. "What did I tell you?" Mrs. Mahone said, clutching Gilligan's arm. "You're right," he answered from his own despair. "It's a sweet honeymoon he's had, poor devil." The party passed on round the station, and she looked at Gilligan again. "Joe, come with me." "To a minister?" he asked, with resurgent hope. "No, just as we are. Then, when we get fed up, all we need to do is wish each other luck and go our ways." He stared at her, shocked. "Damn your Presbyterian soul, Joe. Now you think I'm a bad woman." "No, I don't, ma'am, but I can't do that." "Why not?" "I dunno, I just can't." "But what difference does it make?" "Why, none, if it was just your body I wanted. But I want—" "What do you want, Joe?" "Hell, come on, let's get aboard." "You're coming, then?" "You know I ain't. You knew you were safe when you said that." He picked up her bags. A porter ravished them skillfully from him, and he helped her into the car. She sat upon green plush, and he removed his hat awkwardly, extending his hand. "Well, good-bye." Her face pallid and calm beneath her small white and black hat, above her immaculate collar, she ignored his hand. "Look at me, Joe. Have I ever told you a lie?" "No," he admitted. "Then don't you know I'm not lying now? I meant what I said. Sit down." "No, no, I can't do it that way. You know I can't." "Yes, I can't even seduce you, Joe. I'm sorry. I'd like to make you happy for a short time if I could, but I guess it isn't in the cards, is it?" She raised her face, and he kissed her. "Goodbye. Goodbye, Joe." But why not, he thought, with cinders under his feet. Why not take her this way? I could persuade her in time, perhaps before we reached Atlanta. He turned and sprang back on board the train. He hadn't much time, and when he saw that her seat was empty, he rushed through the car in a mounting excitement. She was not in the next car either. "Have I forgotten which car she's in?" he thought. But no, that was where he'd left her, for there was the negro youth still motionless opposite the window. He hurried back to take another look at her place. Yes, there were her bags. He ran, blundering into other passengers, the whole length of the train. She was not there. "She's changed her mind and got off, looking for me," he thought, in an agony of futile endeavour. He slammed open a vestibule and leapt to the ground as the train began to move. Careless of how he must look to the station loungers, he leaped toward the waiting room. It was empty. A hurried glance up and down the platform did not discover her, and he turned despairing to the moving train. She must be on it, he thought furiously, cursing himself because he had not stayed on it until she reappeared. For now the train was moving too swiftly and all the vestibules were closed. Then the last car slid smoothly past, and he saw her, standing on the rear platform where she had gone in order to see him again, and where he had not thought of looking for her. "Margaret!" he cried after the arrogant steel thing, running vainly down the track after it, seeing it smoothly distancing him. "Margaret!" he cried again, stretching his arms to her to the vocal support of the loungers. "Whup up a little, mister," a voice advised. 10 to 1 on the train. A sporting one offered. There were no takers. He stopped at last, actually weeping with anger and despair, watching her figure in its dark straight dress and white collar and cuffs become smaller and smaller with the diminishing train that left behind a derisive whistle blast, and a trailing, fading vapor like an insult, moving along twin threads of steel out of his sight and his life. At last he left the track at right angles and climbed a wire fence into woods where spring, becoming languorous with summer, turned sweetly nightward, though summer had not quite come. End of section 26. Read by Sandra, Montreal, 2022. Section 27 of Soldier's Pay by William Faulkner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, continued. 6. Deep in a thicket from which the evening was slowly dissolving, a thrush sang 4 liquid notes. Like the shape of her mouth, he thought, feeling the heat of his pain become cool with the cooling of sunset. The small stream murmured busily like a faint incantation, and repeated alder shoots leaned over it, narcissus-like. The thrush, disturbed, flashed a modest streak of brown deeper into the woods, and sang again. Mosquitoes spun about him, unresisted. He seemed to get ease from their sharp irritation. Something else to think about. I could have made up to her. I would make up to her for everything that ever hurt her, so that when she remembered things that once hurt her, she'd say, "Was this I? If I could just have told her. Only I couldn't seem to think of what to say. Me that talks all the time, being stuck for words." Aimlessly he followed the stream. Soon it ran among violet shadows, among willows, and he heard a louder water. Parting the willows, he came upon an old mill race and a small lake, calmly repeating the calm sky and the opposite dark trees. He saw fish gleaming dully upon the earth, and the buttocks of a man. "Lost something?" he asked, watching ripples spread from the man's submerged arm. The other heaved himself to his hands and knees, looking up over his shoulder. "Dropped my tobacco," he replied in an unemphatic drawl. "Don't happen to have none on you, do you? Got a cigarette, if that'll do you any good." Gilligan offered his pack, and the other, sitting back on his heels, took one. "Much obliged. Feller likes a little smoke once in a while, don't he?" "Feller likes a lot of little things in this world once in a while." The other guffawed, not comprehending but suspecting a reference to sex. "Well, I ain't got any of that, but I got the next thing to it." He rose, lean as a hound, and from beneath a willow clump he extracted a gallon jug. With awkward formality he tendered it. "Allers take a mite with me when I go fishin'," he explained. "Seems to make the fish bite more and the mosquiters less." Gilligan took the jug awkwardly. "What in hell did you do with it?" "Here, let me show you," his host said, relieving him of it. Crooking his first finger through the handle, the man raised the jug with a round, back-handed sweep to his horizontal upper arm, craning his neck until his mouth met the mouth of the vessel. Gilligan could see his pumping Adam's apple against the pale sky. He lowered the jug and drew the back of his hand across his mouth. "That's how she's done," he said, handing the thing to Gilligan. Gilligan tried it with inferior success, feeling the stuff chill upon his chin, sopping the front of his waistcoat, but in his throat it was like fire. It seemed to explode pleasantly as soon as it touched his stomach. He lowered the vessel, coughing. "Good God, what is it?" The other laughed hoarsely, slapping his thighs. "Never drunk no corn fore, hain't you? But how does she feel inside? Better now, don't she?" Gilligan admitted that she did. He could feel all his nerves like electric filaments in a bulb. He was conscious of nothing else. Then it became a warmth and an exhilaration. He raised the jug again and did better. "I'll go to Atlanta tomorrow and find her. Catch her before she takes a train out of there," he promised himself. "I will find her. She cannot escape me forever." The other drank again, and Gilligan lit a cigarette. He too knew a sense of freedom, of being master of his destiny. "I'll go to Atlanta tomorrow, find her, make her marry me," he repeated. "Why did I let her go?" "But why not tonight? Sure, why not tonight? I can find her. I know I can, even in New York. Funny I never thought of that before." His legs and arms had no sensation. His cigarette slipped from his nerveless fingers, and reaching for the tiny coal, he wavered, finding that he could no longer control his body. "Hell, I ain't that drunk," he thought. But he was forced to admit that he was. "Say, what was that stuff anyway? I can't hardly stand up." The other guffawed again, flattered. "Ain't she, though? Make her myself, and she's good. You'll get used to it, though. Take another." He drank it like water with unction. "Damn if I do. I gotta get to town." "Take a little sup. I'll put you on the road all right." "If 2 drinks make me feel this good, I'll scream if I take another," he thought. But his friend insisted, and he drank again. "Le's go," he said, returning the jug. The man, carrying her, circled the lake. Gilligan blundered behind him among cypress knees, in occasional mud. After a time he regained some control over his body, and they came to a break in the willows, and a road slashed into the red sandy soil. "Here you be, friend. Just keep right to the road. 'Tain't over a mile." "All right. Much obliged to you. You sure got a son of a gun of a drink there." "She's all right, ain't she?" the other agreed. "Well, good night." Gilligan extended his hand, and the other grasped it formally and limply, and pumped at once from a rigid elbow. "Take care of yourself." "I'll try to," Gilligan promised. The other's gangling, malaria-ridden figure faded again among the willows. The road gashed across the land, stretched silent and empty before him, and below the east was a rumorous promise of moonlight. He trod in dust between dark trees like spilled ink upon the pale, clear page of the sky. And soon the moon was more than a promise. He saw the rim of it, sharpening the tips of trees, saw soon the whole disk, bland as a saucer. Whippoorwills were lost like coins among the trees, and one blundered awkwardly from the dust almost under his feet. The whiskey died away in the loneliness. Soon his temporarily mislaid despair took its place again. After a while, passing beneath crossed skeleton arms on a pole, he crossed the railroad and followed a lane between Negro cabins, smelling the intimate odor of Negroes. The cabins were dark, but from them came soft, meaningless laughter and slow, unemphatic voices, cheerful yet somehow filled with all the old despairs of time and breath. Under the moon, quavering with the passion of spring and flesh, among whitewashed walls papered inwardly with old newspapers, something pagan, using the white man's conventions as it used his clothing, hushed and powerful, not knowing its own power. "Sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." 3 young men passed him, shuffling in the dust. aping their own mute shadows in the dusty road, sharp with the past sweat of labor. You may be fast, but you can't last, 'cause your mama gonna slow you down. He trod on with the moon in his face, seeing the coupled clock squatting like a benignant god on the courthouse against the sky, staring across the town with 4 faces. He passed yet more cabins where sweet, mellow voices called from door to door. A dog bayed the moon, clear and sorrowful, and a voice cursed it in soft syllables. Sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Yes, Jesus, coming for to carry me home. The church loomed a black shadow with a silver roof, and he crossed the lawn, passing beneath slumbrous ivied walls. In the garden, the mockingbird that lived in the magnolia rippled the silence, and along the moony wall of the rectory, from ledge to ledge, something crawled shapelessly. What in hell, thought Gilligan, seeing it pause at Emmy's window. He leaped flower beds swiftly and noiselessly. Here was a convenient gutter, and Jones did not hear him until he had almost reached the window to which the other clung. They regarded each other precariously, the one clinging to the window, the other to the gutter. "What are you trying to do?" Gilligan asked. "Climb up here a little further and I'll show you," Jones told him, snarling his yellow teeth. "Come away from there, fellow. Damn my soul, if here ain't the Squire o' Dames again. We all hoped you'd gone off with that black woman. Are you coming down, or am I coming up there and throw you down?" "I don't know, am I? Or are you?" For reply, Gilligan heaved himself up, grasping the window ledge. Jones, clinging, tried to kick him in the face, but Gilligan caught his foot, releasing his grasp on the gutter. For a moment they swung like a great pendulum against the side of the house. Then Jones's hold on the window was torn loose, and they plunged together into a bed of tulips. Jones was first on his feet, and kicking Gilligan in the side, he fled. Gilligan sprang after him and overtook him smartly. This time it was Hyacinth's. Jones fought like a woman, kicking, clawing, biting, but Gilligan hauled him to his feet and knocked him down. Jones rose again and was felled once more. This time he crawled, and grasping Gilligan's knees, pulled him down. Jones kicked himself free, and rising, fled anew. Gilligan sat up, contemplating pursuit, but gave it up as he watched Jones's unwieldy body leaping away through the moonlight. Jones doubled the church at a good speed, and he let himself out at the gate. He saw no pursuit, so his pace slackened to a walk. Beneath quiet elms his breath became easier. Branches, motionlessly leafed, were still against stars, and mopping his face and neck with his handkerchief, he walked along a deserted street. At a corner he stopped to dip his handkerchief in a trough for watering horses, bathing his face and hands. The water reduced the pain of the blows he'd received, and as he paced fatly on from shadow to moonlight and then to shadow again, dogged by his own skulking and shapeless shadow, the calm, still night washed his recent tribulation completely from his mind. From shadowed porches beyond oaks and maples, elms and magnolias, from beyond screening vines starred with motionless, pallid blossoms, came snatches of hushed talk and sweet, broken laughter. Male and female, created he them young. Jones was young, too. Yet, ah, that spring should vanish with the rose, that youth's sweet-scented manuscript should close. The nightingale that in the branches sang, ah, whence and whither flown again, who knows? Wish I had a girl tonight, he sighed. The moon was serene. Ah, moon of my delight, that knowest no wane, the moon of heaven is rising once again. How oft hereafter rising shall she look through this same garden, after me in vain. But how spring itself is imminent with autumn, with death, as autumn and the moon of death draw nigh, the sad long days of summer herein lie, and she, too warm in sorrow 'neath the trees, turns to night and weeps and longs to die. And in the magic of spring and youth and moonlight, Jones raised his clear sentimental tenor. Sweetheart, sweetheart, sweetheart. His slow shadow blotted out the pen strokes of iron pickets, but when he had passed, the pen strokes were still there upon the dark soft grass. Clumps of petunia and cannas broke the smooth stretch of lawn, and above the bronze foliage of magnolias, the serene columns of a white house rose more beautiful in simplicity than death. Jones leaned his elbows on a gate, staring at his lumpy shadow at his feet, smelling Cape jasmine, hearing a mockingbird somewhere. Jones sighed. It was a sigh of pure ennui. 7. On the rector's desk was a letter addressed to Mr. Julian Lowe, Street, San Francisco, California, telling him of her marriage and of her husband's death. It had been returned by the post office department, stamped "Removed, present address unknown." 8. Gilligan, sitting in the hyacinth bed, watched Jones's flight. "He ain't so bad for a fat one," he admitted, rising. "Emmy'll sure have to sleep single tonight." The mockingbird in the magnolia, as though it had waited for hostilities to cease, sang again. "What in hell have you got to sing about?" Gilligan shook his fist at the tree. The bird ignored him, and he brushed dark earth from his clothes. "Anyway," he soliloquized, "I feel better. Wish I could have held the bastard, though." He passed from the garden with a last look at the ruined hyacinth bed. The rector, looming, met him at the corner of the house beneath the hushed, slumberous passion of the silver tree. "That you, Joe? I thought I heard noises in the garden." "You did. I was trying to beat hell out of that fat one, but I couldn't hold him." He lit out. "Fighting? My dear boy. Wasn't no fight. You was too busy getting away. Takes two folks to fight, Padre." "Fighting doesn't settle anything, Joe. I'm sorry you resorted to it. Was anyone hurt?" "No, worse luck," Gilligan replied ruefully, thinking of his soiled clothes and his abortive vengeance. "I'm glad of that. But boys will fight, eh, Joe? Donald fought in his day." "You damn right he did, Reverend. I bet he was a son of a gun in his day." The rector's heavy-lined face took a flared match. Between his cupped hands he sucked at his pipe. He walked slowly in the moonlight across the lawn toward the gate. Gilligan followed. "I feel restless tonight," he explained. "Shall we walk a while?" They paced slowly beneath arched and moon-bitten trees, scuffing their feet in shadows of leaves. Under the moon, lights in houses were yellow futilities. "Well, Joe, things are back to normal again. People come and go, but Emmy and I seem to be like the biblical rocks. What are your plans?" Gilligan lit a cigarette with ostentatiousness, hiding his embarrassment. "Well, Padre, to tell the truth, I ain't got any. If it's all the same to you, I think I'll stay on with you a while longer." "And welcome, dear boy," the rector answered heartily. Then he stopped and faced the other keenly. "God bless you, Joe. Was it on my account you decided to stay?" Gilligan averted his face guiltily. "Well, Padre." "Not at all. I won't have it. You have already done all you can. This is no place for a young man, Joe." The rector's bald forehead and his blobby nose were intersecting planes in the moonlight. His eyes were cavernous. Gilligan knew suddenly all the old sorrows of the race, black or yellow or white, and he found himself telling the rector all about her. "Tut!" the divine said. "This is bad, Joe." He lowered himself hugely to the edge of the sidewalk, and Gilligan sat beside him. "Circumstance moves in marvelous ways, Joe." "I thought you'd 'a' said God, Reverend." "God is circumstance, Joe. God is in this life. We know nothing about the next. That will take care of itself in good time. The kingdom of God is in man's own heart, the book says. Ain't that a kind of funny doctrine for a parson to get off? Remember, I'm an old man, Joe, too old for bickering or bitterness. We make our own heaven or hell in this world. Who knows? Perhaps when we die we may not be required to go anywhere, nor do anything at all. That would be heaven. Or other people make our heaven and hell for us." The divine put his heavy arm across Gilligan's shoulder. "You're suffering from disappointment, but this will pass away. The saddest thing about love, Joe, is that not only the love cannot last forever, but even the heartbreak is soon forgotten. How does it go? Men have died and worms have eaten them, but not for love." "No, no," as Gilligan would have interrupted. "I know that is an unbearable belief, but all truth is unbearable. Do we not both suffer at this moment from the facts of division and death?" Gilligan knew shame, bothering him now, me with fancied disappointment. The rector spoke again. "I think it would be a good idea for you to stay after all until you make your future plans. So let's consider it closed, eh? Suppose we walk further, unless you're tired." Gilligan rose in effusive negation. After a while the quiet tree-tunneled street became a winding road, and leaving the town behind them they descended and then mounted a hill. Cresting the hill, beneath the moon, seeing the world breaking away from them into dark, moon-slivered ridges above valleys where mist hung slumbrous, they passed a small house sleeping among climbing roses. Beyond it an orchard slept the night away in symmetrical rows, squatting and pregnant. "Willard has good fruit," the divine murmured. The road dropped on again, descending between reddish gashes, and across a level moonlit space, broken by a clump of saplings, came a pure quivering chord of music, wordless and far away. "They are holding services. Negroes," the rector explained. They walked on in the dust, passing neat, tidy houses, dark with slumber. An occasional group of Negroes passed them, bearing lighted lanterns that jetted vain little flames futilely into the moonlight. "No one knows why they do that," the divine replied to Gilligan's question. "Perhaps it is to light their churches with." The singing drew nearer and nearer. At last, crouching among a clump of trees beside the road, they saw the shabby church with its canting travesty of a spire. Within it was a soft glow of kerosene, serving only to make the darkness and the heat thicker, making thicker the imminence of sex after harsh labour among the mooned land, and from it welled the crooning, submerged passion of the dark race. It was nothing, it was everything. Then it swelled to an ecstasy, taking the white man's words as readily as it took his remote God, and made a personal Father of him. "Feed thy sheep, O Jesus," all the longing of mankind for a oneness with something somewhere. "Feed thy sheep, O Jesus." The rector and Gilligan stood side by side in the dusty road. The road went on under the moon, vaguely dissolving without perspective. Worn-out, red-gutted fields were now alternate splashes of soft black and silver. Trees had each a silver nimbus, save those moonward from them, which were sharp as bronze. "Feed thy sheep, O Jesus." The voices rose full and soft. There was no organ was needed, as above the harmonic passion of bass and baritone soared a clear soprano of women's voices like a flight of gold and heavenly birds. They stood together in the dust, the rector in his shapeless black, and Gilligan in his new hard serge, listening, seeing the shabby church become beautiful with mellow longing, passionate and sad. Then the singing died. fading away along the mooned land, inevitable with tomorrow and sweat, with sex and death and damnation, and they turned townward under the moon, feeling dust in their shoes. The end of section 27, and the end of Soldier's Pay by William Faulkner. Read in entirety by Czandra, near Montreal, 2022.